If you're watching this channel, it's because you don't enjoy watching the world squander what Christendom built, and you want to do your part. Today I'd like to mention one means of doing just that: email made by and for Catholics. Check out Fidei Email, that's FIDEI.email, built for Catholic individuals, families, organizations, and groups. They're private, secure, and of course Catholic. God bless.
Cardinal Muller is attending the Synod on Synodality. He was invited there personally by Francis, who, you may recall, had Cardinal Muller serve as his prefect for the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith fairly early in his alleged papacy. And so it's interesting that Cardinal Muller has become one of his more outspoken critics, especially when there are pictures like this of Cardinal Muller smiling and hanging out with Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church. And it's a reminder that no, nothing nefarious is going on there, that it is possible for two men who have very ideologically different viewpoints and very theologically different viewpoints to still respect one another and to treat each other well with respect. And to, in the case here, as Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church tweeted, exchange books with each other that they might find interesting. Again, you see a lot of people online suggesting that something nefarious is going on. I don't think there is anything nefarious going on there, and I would caution people to not lose their charity just because you see people whom you respect rubbing shoulders occasionally with people you don't respect. I'm sure there are times in your life where you've actually spent time with and actually had respect for people whom you did not agree with at all on fundamental issues. It's part of being a human being. That having been said, Cardinal Muller issued a interesting public letter while at the Synod of Synodality, or the Synod of Sin, as we should start calling it. It was in response to something Archbishop Duka, Cardinal Duka of Poland wrote. When Cardinal Burke and the other four dubia cardinals issued their new dubia, that then caused a big storm of controversy a few days before the launch of the Synod of Sin, the Vatican responded to it very publicly when Burke and the other dubia cardinals issued a follow-up claiming that they said that the responses they got from the Vatican were very ambiguous. And so what happened is the Vatican issued their response, their initial response, published it so everybody could see. And the 5 or so questions that Burke and the company asked that should have just simply been given a yes or no answer were 7 pages of ambiguous nonsense. And the Catholic media treated the response Cardinal Burke received as some sort of triumph for Francis, when in reality it was more illustrating the point that they were making. But at the same time that was happening, Cardinal Duca issued his own dubia to Francis about receiving Holy Communion or giving the Eucharist to divorced and civilly remarried Catholics. And he received a response from the Vatican, and almost nobody reported on it, including me at the time. And the response was that, yes, the divorced and civilly remarried, per Amoris Laetitia, can receive Holy Communion. That is heresy, by the way. Anyway, while it was happening, that story got sort of disappeared from the headlines. And so now we get Cardinal Gerhard Muller writing a letter to Cardinal Duca of Poland. It's very eye-opening because while he is attending Francis's Synod of Sin, he has this to say. Here's the letter in full. I think you'll find this interesting. Your Eminence, dear brother Dominic Duca, I have read with great attention the response of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith to your dubia on the post-synodal apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia. Responses to a series of questions here and after response. And I would like to share my evaluation with you. One of the dubia you presented to the DDF concerns the interpretation of Amoris Laetitia contained in a letter from the bishops of the Buenos Aires region of the 5th of September 2016, which allows access to the sacraments to divorced people living in a second civil marriage, even if they continue to behave like husband and wife without the desire to change their lives. According to the response, this text from Buenos Aires belongs to the ordinary pontifical magisterium, having been accepted by the Pope himself. Francis has in fact stated that the interpretation offered by the bishops of Buenos Aires is the only possible interpretation of Amoris Laetitia. The response draws the consequence that religious assent of intelligence and will must be given to this Buenos Aires document, as happens with other texts of the Pope's ordinary magisterium. See Lumen Gentium, paragraph 21. In this regard, it is first of all necessary to clarify from the point of view of the general hermeneutics of the Catholic faith what is the object of the assent of intelligence and will that every Catholic must offer to the authentic magisterium of the Pope and the bishops. Throughout the doctrinal tradition, and in particular in Lumen Gentium, paragraph 25, this religious assent concerns the doctrine of faith and morality that reflects and guarantees the entire truth of revelation. The private opinions of popes and bishops are expressly excluded from the magisterium. Furthermore, any form of magisterial positivism contradicts the Catholic faith because the magisterium cannot teach what has nothing to do with revelation, nor what specifically contradicts the sacred scripture, the apostolic tradition, and the previous defined decisions of the magisterium itself. It is therefore a religious assent to be given to the Buenos Aires text. From a formal point of view, it is already questionable to ask for the religious assent of intelligence and will to a theologically ambiguous interpretation of a partial episcopal conference, the Buenos Aires region, which in turn interprets a statement of Amoris Laetitia, and which requires an explanation, and whose coherence with the teaching of Christ is in question. In fact, the Buenos Aires text seems in discontinuity at least with the teachings of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And even if the response does not say it, the religious assent of intelligence and will must also be given to the documents of the ordinary magisterium of these two popes. However, the response argues that the Buenos Aires text offers an interpretation of Amoris Laetitia in continuity with previous popes. That's it. Let's first see the content of the Buenos Aires text, summarized in the response. The decisive paragraph of the response concerns the third dubium. After having said that John Paul II and Benedict XVI already allowed access to communion when the divorced and remarried agreed to live in continence, Francis's novelty is indicated. Quote, Francis maintains in a proposal of full continence for the divorced and remarried civilly in a new union, but admits that there may be difficulties in practicing it, and therefore allows in certain cases, after adequate discernment, the administration of the sacrament of reconciliation, even when one is unable to be faithful to the continence proposed by the Church. In itself, the expression, even when one is unable to be faithful to the continence proposed by the Church, can be interpreted in two ways. The first, these divorced people try to live in continence, but given the difficulties and due to human weakness, they cannot. In this case, the answer could be in continuity with the teaching of St. John Paul II. The second, these divorced people do not accept living in continence and do not even try. There is therefore no intention of amending themselves. Given the difficulties they encounter in this case, there would be a break with the previous teaching. Everything seems to indicate that the answer refers to the second possibility. In reality, this ambiguity is resolved in the Buenos Aires text, which separates the case in which at least one tries to live in continence from other cases in which this is not the case. In the latter cases, the bishops of Buenos Aires state, quote, in other more complex circumstances, and when it has not been possible to obtain a declaration of nullity, the option mentioned, trying to live in continence, may in fact not be practicable. It is true that this sentence contains another ambiguity, as it states, quote, and when it has not been possible to obtain a declaration of invalidity. Some, noting that the text does not say, and when the marriage was valid, have limited these complex circumstances to those in which, even if the marriage is null for objective reasons, these reasons cannot be proven before the ecclesial forum. As we can see, although Pope Francis presented the Buenos Aires document as the only possible interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, the hermeneutic question is not resolved because there are still different interpretations of the Buenos Aires document. In the end, what we observe both in the response and in the Buenos Aires text is a lack of precision in the wording, which may allow alternative interpretations. In any case, however, even leaving aside these inaccuracies, it seems clear what both the response and the Buenos Aires text mean. It could be formulated as follows. There are particular cases in which, after a period of discernment, it is possible to give sacramental absolution to a baptized person who, after having contracted a sacramental marriage, maintains relations suitable to the married state with a person with whom he or she is in a second union, without the baptized person having to make the resolution not to continue having these relationships, either because he discerns that it is not possible for him or because he discerns that this is not God's will for him. Let's see if this statement can be in continuity with the teachings of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The response's argument that John Paul II had already admitted some of these divorces to communion, and that Francis is therefore only taking a step in the same direction, does not hold up. Continuity, in fact, is not to be found in the fact that someone could now be admitted to communion, but the criterion of this admission. John Paul II and Benedict XVI allowed divorced people who, for serious reasons, live together without having relations suitable to the married state to receive communion. But they do not allow it when these people habitually have these relations, because here there is an objective serious sin, in which one wants to remain, and which, as it affects the sacrament of marriage, acquires a public character. The break between the teaching of the Buenos Aires document and the magisterium of John Paul II and Benedict XVI is perceived when we look at the essential, which is, as I said, the criterion for admission to the sacraments. To be clear, let's imagine that, ironically, a future DDF document proposes a similar argument for allowing the Moloch ritual in some cases, like this. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have already allowed the Moloch ritual in some cases. For example, when the mother has uterine affliction, and this affliction needs to be treated. Now the Moloch ritual is permitted in some other cases. For example, in cases of malformation of the child and continuity with what previous pontiffs have taught. We can see the fallacy of this argument. The case of an operation for uterine affliction is possible because it is not a direct application of the Moloch ritual, but an unintended consequence of a curative action on the mother, according to what has been called the principle of double effect. There would be no continuity, but discontinuity between the two doctrines because the second denies the principle that governed the first position and which condemned any direct application of the Moloch ritual. But the difficulty of teaching the response in the Buenos Aires text, according to the proposed formulation, does not lie only in its discontinuity with the teaching of St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. In fact, this teaching is opposed to other doctrines of the Church, which are not just affirmations of the ordinary magisterium, but have definitively taught as belonging to the deposit of faith. The Council of Trent teaches, in fact, the following truths. The sacramental confession of all serious sins is necessary for salvation. That living in a second union as husband and wife while the marital bond exists is a grave sin of adultery. That a condition for giving absolution is the penitent's contrition, which includes sorrow for the sin and the resolution to sin no more. That it is not impossible for the baptized person to observe the divine precepts. All these statements do not only require religious assent, but must be believed with firm faith, as they are contained in Revelation, or at least accepted and firmly held as they are definitively proposed by the Church. In other words, the choice is no longer between two propositions of the ordinary magisterium, but the acceptance of constitutive elements of Catholic doctrine is at stake. The testimony of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the Council of Trent is ultimately traced back to the clear testimony of the Word of God, which the magisterium serves. The entire pastoral care of Catholics living in second unions after a civil divorce must be based on this testimony, because only obedience to the will of God can serve the salvation of people. Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she, having repudiated her husband, marries another, he commits adultery." And the consequences, neither those who engage in these sins nor adulterers will inherit the kingdom of God. This also means that these divorced people are not worthy of receiving communion before receiving sacramental absolution, which in turn requires repentance of their sins, along with a resolution to amend themselves. Here there is no lack of mercy, but on the contrary, as the mercy of the gospel does not consist in tolerating sin, but in regenerating the hearts of the faithful, so that they live according to the fullness of the love that Christ lived and taught us to live. It follows that those who reject the interpretation of Amoris Laetitia offered by the Buenos Aires text and the response cannot be accused of dissent. Their problem is not that of perceiving an opposition between what they understand and what the magisterium teaches, but of perceiving an opposition between two different teachings of the same magisterium, one of which has now been definitively affirmed. St. Ignatius of Loyola invites us to believe that what we see as white is black if the hierarchical church establishes it as such. But St. Ignatius does not invite us to believe, entrusting ourselves to the magisterium, that what the magisterium itself told us before definitively to be black is white. Furthermore, the difficulties raised by the text of the response do not end there. In fact, the response goes beyond what was stated in Amoris Laetitia and in the Buenos Aires document on two serious points. The first point touches on the question, who decides on the possibility of administering sacramental absolution to divorcees in second unions at the end of the discernment process. In the dubium that you presented to the DDF, dear brother, you propose various alternatives that seem possible to you. It could be the parish priest, the episcopal vicar, the penitentiary. The solution given in the answer must have been a real surprise for you, which you would not even have been able to imagine. In fact, according to the DDF, the final decision must be made conscientiously by every believer. It can be deduced that the confessor limits himself to obeying this decision of conscience. It is striking that it is said that the person must, quote, put himself before God and expose his conscience to him with its possibilities and his limits. If conscience is the voice of God in man, it is not clear what putting one's conscience before God means. It seems that here conscience is rather the private point of view of each individual who then places himself before God. But let's leave this point aside to focus on the surprising statement contained in the DDF text. The faithful themselves decide whether or not to receive absolution, and the priest only has to accept this decision. If this applies in general to all sins, then the sacrament of reconciliation loses its Catholic meaning. It is no longer the humble request for forgiveness of one who finds himself before a merciful judge, who receives the authority of Christ himself, but it is about the absolution of oneself after exploring one's life. This is not far from a Protestant view of the sacrament, condemned by Trent, when he insists on the role of the priest as judge in confession. The Gospel states, referring to the power of the keys, "Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." But the Gospel does not say, "What men decide in conscience that you must loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." It is surprising that the DDF could present a text with such theological error to the Holy Father for his signature during a hearing, thus compromising the Holy Father's authority. The surprise is even greater because the response tries to rely on John Paul II to argue that the decision is up to the individual believer, hiding that the quoted text of John Paul II is directly opposed to the response. In fact, the response cites Ecclesia de Eucharistia, where it says, in the case of receiving the Eucharist, quote, "The judgment on the state of grace obviously belongs only to the person concerned, since it is an evaluation of conscience." But let's see the sentence that John Paul II later adds, which the response does not report, which turns out to be the main idea of this paragraph from Ecclesia de Eucharistia. Quote, "However, in cases of external behavior that is seriously, manifestly, and stably contrary to the moral norm, the Church, in its pastoral care of good community, order, and respect for the sacrament, cannot fail to feel called into the question. The norm of the Code of Canon Law on the non-admission to the Eucharistic communion of those who obstinately persevere in manifest grave sin refers to the situation of manifest moral indisposition." As can be seen, the DDF selected the premise of the text of St. John Paul II by omitting the main conclusion, which is opposed to the thesis of the DDF. If the DDF wants to present a teaching contrary to that of St. John Paul II, the least he can do is not try to use the name and authority of the Holy Pontiff. It would be better to honestly recognize that, according to the DDF, John Paul II was wrong in this teaching of his magisterium. The second novelty contained in the response is that each diocese is encouraged to produce its own guidelines for this discernment process. An immediate conclusion follows. If the guidelines are different, it will happen that divorced people will be able to receive the Eucharist according to the lines of one's diocese and not according to those of another. Now, the unity of the Catholic Church is meant from the earliest times the unity in the reception of the Eucharist. Since we eat the same bread, we are the same body. If a faithful Catholic can receive communion in one diocese, he can receive it in all dioceses that are in communion with the universal Church. This is the unity of the Church, which is based and expressed in the Eucharist. Therefore, the fact that a person can receive communion in one local church and cannot receive it in another is an exact definition of schism. It is unthinkable that the DDF response would want to promote such a thing, but these would be the likely effects of embracing his teachings. Faced with all these difficulties in the DDF's response, what is the way out for those who want to remain faithful to Catholic doctrine? I have already said that the Buenos Aires text and that of the response are not precise. They do not say clearly what they mean and therefore leave open their interpretations, however unlikely. This leaves room for doubts about their interpretation. On the other hand, the way in which the response records the approval of the Holy Father, with a simple dated signature at the foot of the page, is unusual. The usual formula would have been, the Holy Father approves the text and orders or allows its publication. But none of this appears in this poorly edited note. This raises further doubt about the authority of the response. These questions allow us to raise a new dubium, according to what I formulated previously. There are cases in which, after a period of discernment, it is possible to give sacramental absolution to a baptized person who maintains marital relations with a person with whom lives together in a second union, if this baptized person does not want to make the resolution not to continue having these relationships. Dear brother, until this dubium is resolved, the authority of the reply to your dubia on the Buenos Aires letter remains suspended, given the inaccuracies that these texts contain. This opens a small space for the hope that there is a negative answer to this dubium. In this case, the beneficiaries would not be primarily the faithful, who in any case would not be obliged to accept a positive, quote, response to the, quote, dubium as it contradicts Catholic doctrine. The main beneficiary would be authority that responds to the dubium, which would be preserved intact since it would no longer ask the faithful for religious assent of intelligence and will regarding truths contrary to Catholic doctrine. Hoping that this explanation clarifies the meaning of the response you receive from the DDF, I send you my fraternal greetings, in Domine Jesu. Signed, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Muller, Rome. So you see there that Cardinal Muller issued essentially his own dubia himself. If you want to read the text of that, I will have it in today's show notes at returntotradition.org. Just go ahead and check that place out. That's a good backup place to follow me in case you don't get notified about videos of mine anymore. The letter is, of course, meant to be read by another cardinal, but Cardinal Muller made it, of course, public. So he wanted everybody to see this, that you do not have to assent to teachings that go against the doctrines of the faith. And it's interesting to me that he accuses rather openly of Fernandez and Francis of contradicting John Paul II and Benedict XVI. This is another one of those ways of subtly accusing them of being schismatics. Curious what you think of this, though. Are you surprised that Cardinal Muller is attending the Synod of Sin and, sort of openly being quite happy about the participating in the process, while also issuing letters like this? Or do you think that this is going to be little that comes to nothing? I'm very curious what you have to say about this. So let me know what you thought of that letter in the comments. If you think this really is a sort of his own dubia. And hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.